Please be seated. We haven't got a lot of time, and I talk too much. I have to firstly acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. I'm grateful to be here with you all today. I want to also acknowledge Regional Assembly of First Nations Chief Terry Chiji, my friend, who's joining me at the front table, and a host of other people. But I have to take a pause to talk about the 36th Premier, because I only know that because Doug Ford gave me a Toronto Maple Leaf shirt with 36 on the back. He gave all of the premiers a Toronto Maple Leaf jersey with their number on where they sat in the continuum of premiers from their various provinces. And you won't be surprised to know that British Columbia had a very, very high number for a province that entered Confederation in 1871. But nonetheless, you can rest easy. I did leave the jersey behind with some hopeful Leaf fan. I didn't want to put it in my suitcase, and I apologize, Doug, for that, but well, the only thing I got out of that was number 36, so thanks, Ken, for reminding me of once owning a Toronto Maple Leaf jersey. I want to acknowledge in the room a lot of elected representatives from the legislature. Firstly, my colleagues from Cabinet, Minister Bruce Ralston, Minister George Chow, Minister George Heyman, Minister Scott Fraser, Minister Doug Donaldson, as well as Parliamentary Secretary Ravi Kahlon, and a host of opposition members from both political parties demonstrating to all in the room and to all British Columbians that resource development in BC has been our spectacular past, and I believe it is part and parcel of our rosy future. It's good to be back in Prince George on a warmer day. I was here last week in the minus 40 period, and as someone who grew up below the 49th parallel on southern Vancouver Island, I was excited to go to an outdoor hockey game. That's not something we did on the unfrozen lakes of Victoria growing up, but the idea of coming to Fort St. James to watch an outdoor hockey game was very appealing to me in July. But when January rolled around and I continued to watch the temperature drop and drop and drop, I can now appreciate the excitement on the faces of the people in the community when the temperature dropped to only minus 20 rather than the minus 40 from the day before. But the cold did not dampen the warmness of my reception, and I don't take that as a personal reception. It was a reception from a community and a host of communities from Kitimat through to Prince George and Quesnel, who see a bright and optimistic future with respect to resource development in northern British Columbia. I want to start, of course, by talking about LNG. LNG Canada, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history, is going to lead to tremendous opportunities for communities right across the corridor from wellhead to waterline. Thousands of people will benefit, 10,000 construction jobs, countless other businesses that will emerge from servicing the development of the pipeline and the creation of the export facility in Kitimat. I was just saying to Rio Tinto, representative from Rio Tinto, that the partnership with respect to the jetty and taking full advantage of this competitive position we have, and Ken talked about the Port of Prince Rupert, but the Douglas Channel and Kitimat is also a unique opportunity for British Columbia and Canada to get goods to markets, not just across the Pacific, but indeed around the world. And it's that partnership with respect to LNG Canada and Rio Tinto, two titans, I think it's fair to say, without offending anybody, two large companies that have decided that British Columbia is a good place to invest capital because of the skilled workforce, because of an entrepreneurial bent of the people in the north. It's difficult to live in minus 40 for a long period of time, and that is a testament to the caliber of people who want to live and experience great opportunities here in northern BC. I want to touch a little bit, of course, on the challenges that we're experiencing along the corridor. Not everyone in British Columbia supports LNG Canada. Not everyone in British Columbia supports the industries that are represented and reflected in this room. This is not an epiphany for anyone here. This is not a revelation. British Columbia, like families, like communities, have differing opinions on what's the best way forward. But it's been my view, based on my family experience, my community experience, and my experience in the legislature, that the best way forward is always through dialogue. And I was pleased when I asked former MP Nathan Cullen to work with the province, to work with Coastal GasLink, and to work with the hereditary leadership of the Wet'suwet'en Territory to find a way forward to peaceful resolution to an impasse that we're currently experiencing. I'm under no illusion that any minds will be changed, and I think it's important that we start from that premise. Minds will not be changed. It's absolutely legitimate for citizens to have opposing views, absolutely legitimate for people in this room to have different political perspectives. That is how we operate daily within British Columbia, within Canada, and indeed in most countries around the world. So to find conflict in an area of British Columbia is not a surprise, but it's a challenge for all of us and an opportunity indeed for our economy. I believe that LNG is an opportunity for not just Northern British Columbia, but indeed all British Columbians. But it's not just the mill and the mine and the plant that makes resource economies work. You need to have services as well. I was just talking to Mayor Carroll from Terrace. Significant challenges to a community that is very close to the epicenter of the economic activity, but not within the area to capture some of the tax benefits from that activity. The services required in Terrace are no different than the services required in Kitimat or Prince George or Dawson Creek or Fort St. John. But there's an inability to capture that, and we need to find innovative ways so that communities that are not directly affected by the economic benefit are not adversely affected by the potential downturn. One of the primary reasons I was in Fort St. James last week was not just to enjoy a good Canadian winter pastime, because we all know that lacrosse is Canada's national summer sport. Thank you to two lacrosse friends in the building. That's good. But it was to announce the final decision on building a new hospital in Fort St. James. Now, I had been to Fort St. James early in my mandate as the 36th Premier, and I was struck by the focus of the people in the community. There are a range of issues people want to talk to elected representatives about when you come upon them, whether it's in events like this, or whether it's walking down the street, or whether it's just having a cup of coffee. Everyone was focused on making sure that when the Premier rolled through town, he knew that there was absolutely universal 100% support for an investment in new healthcare facilities in Fort St. James. I went to the hospital, to ATCO trailers tied together by baling wire and duct tape, and I talked to the physicians there who've been doing their level best to practice medicine in the 21st century, as well as some of the patients in the long-term and continuing care beds that were at that facility. And it was absolutely apparent to me that if we were going to be able to benefit from the economic opportunities that the resource economies in and around Fort St. James presented, we needed to make sure there were services for the people there. So I was delighted to come back after 18 months of planning through the concept stage, through the business plan stage, and announce that a hospital in Fort St. James is a go. Now that's good news for Fort St. James, but it's also good news for a community that has been racked by changes in the forest sector. We all know that there's a downturn right now that's affecting thousands of jobs with mills closures right across the interior of British Columbia. This is not something that happened by accident on one day in the past year or 2 or 3 or 10. It's a result of the mountain pine beetle. It's a result of historic fire seasons back-to-back in 2017, 2018. And it's a result of an industry that had been focused, quite rightly so, on getting as much volume out of our forests as they possibly could when prices were high, so the benefits could be spread throughout communities and throughout companies. Well, the world's a different place. The forest base is a different base. And if we are going to find a way forward, we need to do it together. And that's why I'm so proud of Mackenzie. Yesterday hosted the first timber supply table. We've been asking communities to come together. Mayor Atkinson, industry leaders, Indigenous leaders, labor leaders, all came together yesterday to kickstart a discussion and a dialogue about what the future holds for the community of Mackenzie. And I was hopeful that a dozen people would show up from the various interests. It turns out that 50 people showed up. And these are not just passersby, and passersby are welcome. I'm not discriminating. These were decision makers within the territory of the Indigenous communities, within Mackenzie, within the industries that operate there. Union leaders from steel, from Unifor, and others coming together to plan a way forward. That is the way forward in forestry, and that is also the way forward for communities. If we're not prepared to address the realities that we face If we're prepared to instead stick our head in the sand and hope that a tax change or a shift in perspective from the United States will somehow allow us to flow greater volumes of forest products into the marketplace, we're deceiving ourselves. But if we all agree that our forest past is glorious and our forest future can be equally glorious, we can only do that by changing how we operate. And that means adding more value, getting more out of our forests each day we go to work. And I've been hearing that wherever I go, an acknowledgement and a recognition that that's the way forward. I was in Quesnel last week and I visited 2 West Fraser facilities, the sawmill and the plywood plant. And it was at the plywood plant that I was most encouraged by companies and communities working together to pick up the slack as we see some permanent and some temporary curtailments of activity in the forest sector. The mill in Chasm has closed forever. The workers in Chasm did not have another opportunity or prospect in the South Caribou, but they were finding jobs in Quesnel. And as I went through the tour, the mill manager would say, oh, there's someone who we just signed on from Chasm. And I said, well, how many people from Chasm are here? And he said, oh, gee, let me think about that. And he's going through his fingers. He said, we got about a dozen. So 100 workers displaced in Chasm, a tenth of them found employment within the company, within the region, and they're comfortably making family-supporting wages and continuing to develop their careers in the forest sector. So companies like West Fraser and others who are saying we have displacements, but we have spaces through the traditional retirement processes and rolling people through, that's the way forward. And it requires cooperation, patience, and a view of making sure that forestry is as bright tomorrow as it has been in the past. There's a couple of other bright spots on the horizon. Of course, LNG consumes a lot of bandwidth, whether it be talking about the jobs, whether it be talking about the investment dollars that will lead to more opportunities for creating the good society that we all want. $23 billion of revenue will come to the Crown that can be used to distribute social and economic and cultural initiatives right across the province. That's all good news. But there's good news in the mining sector as well. Mineral exploration in particular is an area I want to touch upon for a moment. The Mining Jobs Task Force we put together shortly after we formed government issued its report, and we see a lot of positives in there. Over the past number of years, we've seen a spike in investment in exploration, mineral exploration. Between 2016 and 2018, tripled mineral exploration investment. Now, this is a cyclical industry, as are many of the industries represented in this room, and you know that if commodity prices aren't in your favor, there are going to be lean periods. But on the mineral exploration side, AMEBC had their traditional roundup this past 2 weeks ago. 5,000 delegates came to Vancouver to talk about the opportunities, not just here in British Columbia, but indeed around the world. BC is a mine. Oh, there's a clap. Thanks. Opportunity to drink. BC is a mining province, has been and will continue to be. The opportunities we have to have a low-carbon economy and to be leaders in climate action flow from our ability to access copper, to access metallurgical coal so that the steel we'll need to build the new economy and the copper we'll need to electrify that new economy can be sourced right here in BC. That's a competitive advantage. We don't want to give that up. $1 million investment in the BC Regional Mining Alliance, again, sends a signal to the mining sector that BC is not only open for business, but we want to find ways to build on the relationships between Indigenous people and the mining sector, which has been, in my opinion, the benchmark, the gold standard, if I can use a mining phrase, sort of. It's kind of a joke, gold standard. Ralph liked that, thanks, man. But it is. The mining sector employs more Indigenous people than any other sector in British Columbia. That's critically important in our past, and it's critically important to our future. But it's not just employment. When I think of the Tahltan, who look at the continuum of opportunities in the mining sector from jobs to ownership and everything in between, the service companies that are needed to keep the industry going, those can and will be Indigenous-led companies, and the Tahltan are leading the way in that regard. And although the global economy is fragile right now, that's not the first time that's ever happened. And I'm fairly confident, I think I can say without being a soothsayer, that the commodity markets will be flat and some other time in the future. Hopefully the distant future, but it will happen again. And what we will measure our success by as a community and as by companies is not how we deal with the challenge today, but how we prepare for the future that we all want to see. And that has to involve, in British Columbia, a low-carbon future and a future that includes Indigenous people as full and free partners in the development of their lands. And that's what the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is all about. At the beginning of the day, at the middle of the day, and at the end of the day, the Declaration, unanimously supported, proudly, I say, unanimously supported by every corner of the legislature, every part of British Columbia, is a turning of the page on a history that sometimes we often don't want to talk about. But we are going to go into a future that we can all be proud of, and it is a future that involves partnerships with Indigenous peoples. I'm proud of that. I believe every member of the legislature is proud of that, and everyone in this room should be proud of that as well. Because when investors in the modern economy look to put their dollars down, they want to see if there's going to be an environmental impact that will lead to disruption, and they want to make sure that Indigenous peoples are full participants. The mining sector has led the way. LNG Canada has done an outstanding job, and there are forest companies in this room and across BC that are doing their level best to make sure that we are doing our level best to include all British Columbians in the prosperity that we want, not just for ourselves, but for everybody. Back for a moment to the mining sector, there's a few other things, not just on the mineral exploration side with respect to making permanent flow-through shares and other tax incentives that had been annual incentives are now permanent. That sends, again, a message to the investment community that it's not going to be you better do it this year, it's not going to be there ever again. This, again, allows people to make reasonable decisions about investment, and that's to the benefit of everyone. But we also, through the Mining Task Force, established two separate branches within the Ministry of Energy, Mines, and Petroleum Resources to deal with safety and compliance on the one hand, and permitting and enforcement on the other hand, permits and promotion on the other hand. The uninitiated would look at British Columbia and say, you've got the same people issuing permits, doing promotion, and also doing compliance. That appears and is an internal conflict that I believe we needed to address, not just for those in industry who want to see permits accelerated, but also for the broader community so they can have confidence that our mining industry is focused on the future, is focused on ensuring environmental standards are as the highest that they can be, and that's done by just a few administrative changes to make sure that we don't have internal conflicts in how we operate. That's a positive signal to the world. It's a positive signal to investment. And so it's not just about creating the environment for better activities. It's about actually doing more. And although I believe we've made progress in the past 30 months, there's much more to do. And the mining industry needs to know that I understand that we need to accelerate the issuance of permits. The whole intent of the environmental assessment process is not to say no, is to say yes to projects that make sense in communities, make sense to British Columbians. And in order to do that, you need to move these things through fairly effectively. As we all know, capital can move in the blink of an eye, and if we are not responsive to the needs of investment, and I don't say slavishly responsive, but responsive, we're going to see opportunities pass us by. I don't want to see that. You don't want to see that. So again, working together with Indigenous peoples and the environmental assessment process, Minister Heyman has just modernized it in the last session of the legislature, and there is more work that we can do to make sure that our regulatory regime meets the expectations of the public, but also is not an impediment to better outcomes for people and communities right across BC. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about how we bring, and again, it's not just forestry, mining, and natural gas, although those are the foundational big players at the corral. There's also a whole host of other initiatives on the land base that we need to focus on. Guide outfitters, for example, those that are on the land every day, finding opportunities to create wealth for themselves and for their community. Agriculture, a gentleman stopped me on the way in and said, how come no one's talking about food? Don't we need a lot of food? And I see my friend Bob Simpson, who sat me down when I was in Quesnel, not just to talk about forest innovation, which Quesnel is leading the way on, but also to talk about how we can bring food security to a place where it makes sense for providers and producers to make a way forward on the land base that makes sense in the long term. We appointed a food security task force headed by Peter Dillon of Ocean Spray, and I don't want to preempt this because Lana Popham and he are going to be announcing the findings of the Agri-Tech task force later in the week. But I think it's fair to say that I'm pretty excited about a future in feeding people. That is, of course, what we all count on, whether we're Liberals, Greens, or New Democrats. And I know that I'm doing my share to eat up the available food, but we all need it. And the more we can produce here, the better off we're all going to be, not just in terms of transportation costs and the impact on climate, but on creating a place where we can count on food that is locally grown and that is not just feeding ourselves, but feeding a new economy on the land in rural British Columbia. And that means displacing some other issues when it comes to growing food and to getting it into the marketplace. But I think you'll be excited to see the findings of the task force. Mr. Dillon did an outstanding job. And their enthusiasm, when I met with the 3 commissioners this week, their enthusiasm is infectious. And I encourage you, if you get an opportunity to download the report later this week when it becomes public, to try and find the same excitement about food security and food production here in British Columbia, because it's critically important to our well-being. Lastly, I want to come back to forestry for a moment, because it's not just about all working together and holding hands and the kumbaya that I'm sure some people are thinking. Although it's important, we also have to shift how we use our forest products. And I want to give a shout out to Kalashnikov Lumber and Structure Lam in the Kootenays and in the South Okanagan for being trailblazers when it comes to mass timber and cross-laminated timber particularly. We have adopted the 2020 building code prior to any other jurisdiction in the country, because we believe that mass timber is not just a way forward to sequester carbon, it's not just a way forward in seismically sensitive areas like where I live in Victoria and in the Lower Mainland, but it's also a way to create more value from our forests that makes sense not just to investment, but makes sense to the community as well. And by increasing the height of wood structures, we're creating a domestic market for our wood products that will then become an international market. When I was in London last year, I talked to a mass timber construction company. 66 significant buildings in Greater London have been developed through mass timber construction. And you might know this, there's not a lot of lumber in the UK. They're sourcing from Austria and from Italy, when they could certainly, after Brexit, could be sourcing that from British Columbia. It's in the name. We're taking a prince. I think it's only fair. We take the prince, you take some of our lumber products. Thank you for that. They said that's not going to work. I said, no, it's going to work. Everybody likes Prince Harry. What's not to like? It's a sitcom waiting to be written. For any budding screenwriters out there, do your best. But there are opportunities on mass timber. There are opportunities that are being fulfilled right now. Structure Lam is building Microsoft's new head office in San Jose, California, with lumber products developed here in British Columbia. And that's just the beginning, ladies and gentlemen. As we transition to the new forest economy, I see great things ahead. And just to conclude, because I know we get to sit down and be uncomfortable in these chairs in a minute. I know I'm going to be uncomfortable. I don't know how you're going to feel about it. I want to just conclude by saying LNG is on the rise. Mining continues to be an important part of our economic future. And forestry has been a key part of our past and will be a vital part of our future. Our overall economy depends on it. We have balanced budgets. We have the highest credit rating in the country, the lowest unemployment rate. Our growth is projected to be the highest in the country again. All of that is good news. Those foundations are critically important. But what will keep that all going for this year, next year, and the year after that is a commitment by everyone in this room to acknowledge that there are going to be differences of opinion when it comes to economic activity in British Columbia, because it's British Columbia. But that doesn't make us unique, because families disagree on issues, communities disagree on issues. It's highly and absolutely appropriate for British Columbians to disagree on issues. But at the end of the day, if we work together with a common focus on lifting everyone up, making sure our economy works not just for us, but for all of our communities, we're all going to be better off. And I see a very bright future for BC, and I want you to join me on that journey. Thank you very much. Hi.
Thank you so much, Premier. I'm inviting Kendra Johnston, the President and CEO of the Association for Mineral Exploration, to moderate a few questions here. So please, thanks.
How are you? Great, thanks. Comfortable?
Absolutely.
We don't look awkward at all. No.
Got that one in right at the same time.
Good.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and I know C3 has been thrilled to have you join us, so thank you for that. I think we'll maybe just jump right in. We don't have a lot of time today, so you mentioned it in your speech, but it's also been a hot topic around the forum for the last day and a half, so the Wet'suwet'en situation. How do you see that situation resolving itself?
Well, as I mentioned, I've asked former MP Nathan Cullen to act as an intermediary. I'd reached out to the Wet'suwet'en leadership to speak with them on a telephone. I was not able to change a week-long tour plan to divert to Smithers and to Wet'suwet'en territory. They weren't prepared to talk to me on the phone. I have met, just so everyone in the room is aware, I met in a day-long session at the request of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders last year at what's called a Smokehouse Feast. I was honored to be there. We talked about a range of issues. We followed that up with a half-day session at the office of the Wet'suwet'en boardroom. And so we are working as best we can in the interest of the Wet'suwet'en, but also in the interest of all of the other nations that are anxious to benefit from what will flow from Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada. And I always highlight Crystal Smith, and I apologize, Crystal, I know you're in here somewhere. I keep constantly pointing to her. There she is. But there are nations right across the north who see an opportunity to lift themselves from poverty to prosperity. I talked to Chief Terry Teegee about the balance between environment and the economy, which we're always striving for as individuals and as a community. And I think there's just too much positive on this file to allow it to languish. But I also know that we need to respect the views of the individuals and the clans within Wet'suwet'en territory who have a different point of view. Nathan has been working with CGL, with Wet'suwet'en, with the RCMP. Again, a reminder, the province does not issue injunctions, the courts do, with no direction from the province. The province does not direct law enforcement on how to enforce injunctions. That's entirely an operational issue. So as Premier and as a government, we have no role to play following the injunction and what actions will take place. But we do have a role to ensure safety for citizens. We do have a role to ensure that dialogue will continue. And I'm confident that, and I'm not suggesting, there's no expectation that I'm going to change anyone's mind about where they stand on any issue, not just this one, but on any issue. That's not my job. My job is to try and make the best of the circumstances we find ourselves in, and I believe we're in a very positive place, and with goodwill and dialogue on both sides, we'll find a way forward. And I commend CGL for their patience, and also the Wet'suwet'en for their desire to continue to try and find a dialogue.
And dialogue, of course, is key, and I do believe that Minister Fraser was up in that region last week, and Minister Fraser, of course, had a remarkable year last year with UNDRIP passing, and that was such a pleasure. I actually got to be in the House for the introduction of that bill, and that was an honor to be there. But I'm just wondering your thoughts on how UNDRIP is going to impede, if at all, the natural resource sector.
Well, firstly, had we not, and I also want to lift my hands to Scott Fraser, who worked very hard and listened and crisscrossed the province, engaging with communities, not just the Leadership Council, of which Terry is a member, but also to nations large and small to hear their concerns. That was his mandate, and he discharged it very well. It was a busy year for him. But I say to those who are dubious, first of all, unanimous support in the legislature. After one of the most robust debates of legislation I've seen in my 15 years as an elected representative, Minister Fraser stood for a week answering questions, good, thoughtful questions from the opposition. And I think we're better for that dialogue. We're better for that discussion. And to those who say this is going to be a negative for resource development, I say, well, is the status quo working for you? And whether we had agreed on UNDRIP or not, the Wet'suwet'en situation would still be here. So those who are trying to connect the two are doing a disservice to the Wet'suwet'en, and they're doing a disservice to the debate about how we build a strong economy for everybody. There are so many examples, positive examples, of Indigenous communities working with investment for good outcomes for everybody. We don't talk about those nearly enough. I made reference to the Tahltan, who never ceased to amaze me, their ability to find opportunity at the farthest corner of British Columbia on the west side, and that's no disrespect to Laurie Ackerman and on the east side, but it never ceases to amaze me that people of goodwill, investors, Indigenous people, community leaders, when you sit down and figure it out, everybody benefits. And the declaration is the stepping stone to a brighter future. It's not an obstacle. And I don't want to put words in Terry's mouth, but the notion that free, prior, and informed consent is somehow revolutionary is just not the case. It's reasonable to expect that you're coming into someone's backyard to do some work. Yeah, ask them about it, not just as a checkbox on a form, but to have a genuine discussion and build a relationship.
Absolutely, and I do think we see those changes happening. And last week at Roundup, I actually made a comment that in my relatively short career, 15 years, I have actually never embarked on a project where it hasn't been customary to go and speak with your local community. So those changes are coming.
And again, the mining sector has led the way. Mm-hmm. And the small footprint, localized, but can have profound impacts on traditional activities and traditional practices. And the best way to go forward is to say, how can we do this in a way that meets everyone's needs? And props to the mining sector.
Absolutely, thank you. So let's move over to investment. Being part of the Mining Jobs Task Force, one of the goals of that report was to build the best jurisdiction in the world to mine and to explore. If we expand that to the natural resources sector, how do we go about making BC the best place in the world to work?
Well, as I said in my remarks, we've done a number of initiatives separating promotion and compliance, for example. Again, that's a symbolic change, but it's a real change as well. And we put a significant amount of increase the budget at Energy Mines because we want to continue to see economic activity, but we want to make sure it's done in a way that's defensible, not just to the stakeholders in the immediate area, but it's defensible within British Columbia, within Canada, within the investment community around the world. So those steps have been taken. We're down that path. But I still hear from large operators and small that permitting can take 7, 8, 9, 10 years. That was not the intention of the initial Environmental Assessment Act. I don't want to date myself, but I was working as a government employee when that was introduced back in the 1990s. And the intention, Mike Harcourt talked to me about this quite a bit. Mike, if you've never met Mike, he'll talk to you all day long. I'm sure if you gave him a call, he'd tell you about the genesis of the EA process. But it was not to say no, it was to allow investment some certainty that once they were into the process, there would be a way out. Over the past 30 years, the process starts and stops because new information is required. Applications are characterized as incomplete. Capacity within Indigenous communities needs to be lifted up. And so if we're going to be able to shorten that 8 to 10 year period to a more reasonable period, we need to make sure that all of the participants are not cutting regulation for the sake of cutting regulations, modernizing regulation, ensuring that compliance and permitting are not symbiotic, but also not at odds. And I think that we're on the right track, and I continue those in the mining sector who have advice for me. I'm sure you'll give it freely and succinctly whenever we get the chance to talk or through correspondence. But I have talked to industry leaders, and they say, yeah, well, we like what you're saying, but you need to show us that you're making progress. And so I put Bruce Ralston, one of my taller colleagues. I'm not allowed to have favorites, but Bruce and I have been together for a long, long time, and we have a similar view on the economy, and and I put him in charge of invigorating the environment, or invigorating the mining sector within his ministry. We're already well underway. Michelle Mongdell did a lot of good work, and Bruce is going to pick that up and run it to the finish line.
Absolutely, we're definitely looking forward to working with them. If we expand again to the entire BC resources sector and look at the products that we are producing, whether it be the metals in the ground that we're extracting or the trees that we're harvesting, how does government go about building the new markets outside of British Columbia for our resource projects and really going about attracting dollars?
Well, on the forestry side, 55% of our exports have historically gone to the United States. I think that forestry workers and investors here and companies here in the room will know that every 10 years we do this dance about us not being an open market. We have a clutch of lumber barons in the southeast of the United States who have significant political sway over Democrats and Republicans, and we find ourselves in this endless loop every decade about having to justify how we operate our public forests. And the acknowledgement that we have public forests seems to be the initial stumbling block, but we're not changing that. The people of BC do not want us to change that. So when we're talking about stumpage changes, when we're talking about how can government work with industry to make life easier, we need to do it with a delicate hand, because every movement we make, every breath we take, they be watching us. And so, thank you for that. Musician son, that's how that came from. So in order to protect ourselves from more onerous countervail duties, we need to make sure that we're doing this in a way that's open and transparent, but also meets the needs of the owners of the forest, which are the people in this room. And I'm unapologetic about that, and successive governments have been unapologetic about that, and I think that's the way it should be. But we also need to not knee-jerk on these issues. This is, anyone, I don't want to ask for a show of hands because I might get too many, but the downturn in the forest sector didn't arrive 2 years ago. It's been building. The pine beetle was the short-term solution. Let's get it out of the way as quickly as we can. But we need a long-term solution, and that means building new markets. Doug Donaldson has been to Asia twice, at least twice. I don't know, Doug, how many times have you been? 3 times. Sorry, man. I had to sign that off. I don't recall. I guess we're down a form, regulatory reform in the office. But we've been trying to build new markets by going with industry to demonstrate that British Columbians' products are highly desirable. Of course they are. And again, on this CLT or mass timber front, I listened to industry who said, yeah, well, we don't want to take a hope and a prayer on that. So we've mandated that significant public sector investments, hospitals like St. Paul's Hospital, which will be a massive new build in Vancouver, will be a mass timber where possible. There are some areas where, of course, a hospital can't be using mass timber, but where possible, we're creating a domestic market. Now, it's modest, but it's a beginning of a larger market. In my community in Langford, the mayor and council just added a new section to the stadium that Rugby Canada is located at. The women's sevens are coming in March. Come to Langford, enjoy the women's rugby sevens. And they built it with CLT. And I was really excited about that until the mayor told me that they accessed the CLT, the cross-laminated timber, from Italy, because they couldn't get enough of it in British Columbia. So if ever there was an anecdote that tells you that there's a market, small community on Vancouver Island wants to use cross-laminated timber, and they had to source it from Europe, not from the interior. So we need to create a domestic market so that international markets will say that's the place we want to get our product.
We do, and creating that BC brand, because we really do produce the best products in the world. So we have to get those out there.
Best cherries as well.
And I do believe that is all the time we have. We're getting the mark from the side over here. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with not only myself, but the
We didn't look uncomfortable at all, did we? No.
Great. Thank you.